Hello and welcome back to the Academy of Historical Fencing. Today I'm going to be talking about the weights and balances of quite a range of swords, the kind of stuff that we study in the club as well as things that we don't, quite a sort of mixture, all the kind of common things that people would sort of look to for weights and balances of swords. I think it's one of those quite misunderstood subjects, ranging from the sort of public attitude from some people of swords are really heavy to others thinking that they're featherweight. Popular culture of course plays a part. Some would have you believe that certain swords weigh an absolute ton, particularly when it comes to representing European swords in films, of course. Other times you see sort of, representations of Chinese and Japanese swords and they're sort of featherweight, and there can be a mix of all kinds of things in between. You only have to watch the saber fight in that Bond film to think that sabers and longswords might actually weigh an absolute ton. So I'm going to be talking about different swords, weights and balances. This video is going to be all about the props, and that is the actual swords and things, common items to compare them to, just to give a little bit of context, I suppose. Because even people, I talk in these videos about the sort of weights and balances of swords that I own and antiques and originals and things like that, but I don't think you always necessarily get get it in context or sort of, get an understanding of how it relates to the real world, if you like. So, first of all, are swords heavy? No. They are actually really quite light, and that's really no surprise. They're not supposed to be a club or anything like that. There are of course swords that are heavier than others, and there are ones that are particularly on the heavy range for their size. But overall, swords are not heavy, but they can feel heavy according to their handling characteristics, and that is in large part due to their balance. The point of balance of a sword is wherever the essentially the guard ends. So this is what we would call the tang shoulder. You measure from there, balance your finger roughly in position so that it balances on the sword, and that's the measurement, which you can see that's around about 3 inches or 7.5 centimeters. That's the typical way to balance a sword. Also, mass distribution plays a massive part because there are many ways to create a balance like that. So you can see a small sword with a 4-inch balance, and you can see a saber with a 4-inch balance, and you can then see a longsword and a rapier all with a 4-inch balance. It's not to say they all have those balance points, of course they don't, but you can find examples of all those sword types with that balance point, and it's created in many different ways. If you think about it, a saber, for example, commonly doesn't have a pommel, and that of course will drive the balance down towards the tip of the sword compared to an equivalent weight sword. Likewise, some sabers, like cavalry sabers, you see they flare at the tip, and that can further create a really forward balance. So is more to consider than just balance. Mass distribution is really, really important. But anyway, moving on. The small sword. Let's look at some actual examples. What does a small sword weigh? Well, this is a Kalishimard small sword from the early to mid 18th century, really typical example of the small sword, and it weighs exactly the same as a little bottle of beer. And I do mean little, this is 275 millilitres. To the gram, these weigh exactly the same. And that gives you an idea just how light a small sword really is. And it's true, the small sword is an incredibly light sword. It's typically as much as 1/3 the weight of a rapier, or 1/2 the weight of many sabers. So yeah, the small sword is really, really light. And if you look to the really heavy end, a small ball peen hammer, 550 grams, that would be the kind of really heavy end of a small sword, which is not exactly heavy. So yeah, a few props for you there to understand just how light the small sword really is. So I've taken some figures down on different kind of swords, and I'm going to talk about how they relate to different kind of weapons. And we're going to start light and we're going to move up the scale as we go along. Of course, some sword categories are going to overlap, but we'll kind of start light and we'll gradually move heavier. So we've gone from the small sword onto the Spadron. For those of you that haven't seen the video about Spadron that I did, the Spadron is essentially a militarized small sword, or a lightweight broadsword. It's a weapon for officers to carry, and it is, I would generally say, a very poor weapon, and that's certainly backed up by the facts historically. But anyway, it's an important weapon to our history. A Spadron weighs roughly 700 grams, And what does that relate to? Well, an average size adjustable wrench or spanner that's exactly the same weight as a spadron. So again, not exactly heavy, but a good bit heavier than a small sword. I said small sword is in the range of 450 to 550 grams on average, and a spadron is averaging about 700. So you can see the spadron is just that touch heavier, gives it a bit of a cutting edge and does cut, albeit not particularly brilliantly, but it can cut, unlike the small sword that cannot. So there's the spadron. Then we're going to move on to the hanger and cutlass, which is effectively a short spear. A short saber. These can range quite a lot, but typically somewhere in the 700 to 800 gram weight range. So again, that adjustable wrench is about right. Yeah, so it's not especially heavy, but for its size, they can sometimes weigh as much as an infantry saber. So considering they're so much shorter, they can feel reasonably heavy. So there's the hanger for you. Moving on to something more typical, because the saber is, after all, what we're always about. 1803 British infantry saber. Now, this is my favourite saber design of all time. I bring it out all the time into videos. It's what we're kind of practicing for on a regular basis with that sort of Georgian or Napoleonic style or period saber combat. So this is an infantry saber, and it weighs exactly what a bottle of beer or cider weighs. Exactly, in fact, this sword weighs to the gram what this Henry Weston bottle of cider does. So again, a pint of beer or a pint of cider in a glass bottle, that's the weight of an infantry saber. So you can tell that it really, really is not all that heavy. And just to talk about some other sabers that are used on foot, this is a kind of a typical Victorian period British infantry sword. In fact, this is a rifle officer's sword, and therefore is the exact successor to the 1803 pattern I just showed you. So this is the next period along, and it only weighs a little bit more, and that's in large part to do with having a slightly larger guard, and it's a little bit longer as well. So this is 850 grams, and that's kind of a really typical range for Victorian infantry sabers. There we go. So there's your saber. What are we going to go on to? At this point, I suppose I have to talk about the katana. I bring up the katana all the time because people are interested in the katana. Everyone is, and so am I. They range a massive amount. In terms of, they can be down as low as 600 grams, and they can push up to 1.2, 1.3 kilos. So they vary a little bit depending on the time period and whether they're being used in war, whether they're being used in civilian life. But say a common, really average range would be around about 900 grams to a kilo, roughly. But it's a very, very rough range because you're talking about a sword, like the saber, I suppose, that was in use for a very long period of time and varied quite a lot. So katana range is going to spread across quite a few of these ranges that I'm talking about today. Going on to something like an arming sword or a Viking sword. Here's a nice Viking sword. This is an Albion, so it's a very high quality reproduction of an original. And Viking swords, arming swords, that the typical sort of one-handed swords, they all weigh roughly a similar range, and they're usually around about 1 kilo. They can get a little bit lower, down to about 900, and they can go up to a sort of 1.2 kilos. So, what does that compare to? Well, a bottle of wine. A bottle of wine is 1.1 kilos. So that's in a normal range of a sort of Viking sword or a medieval arming sword. What else is in that range? Let's see. Well, there's some nice examples for you. Plenty of Americans on this channel, so let's take it to guns. 1851 Colt Navy, you're talking around about 1.15 kilos, roughly. And there you go, that's therefore exactly in the kind of typical range of arming swords and Viking swords and that kind of thing. And also, what also happens to fit exactly into that is a loaded Colt 1911. So there you go. that fits really, really nicely. Exactly the same weight range. In fact, this particular Viking sword is 1 kilo, but they can vary a little bit. Colt, 1.15 kilo, but it's in the sort of typical range of weights. Right. What else should we go on to? Oh, we haven't done cavalry sabers. Now, cavalry sabers tend to be a bit heavier than a infantry saber. So, one of the most iconic, certainly in Britain, is the 1796 light cavalry. And now these typically range in the 900 grams to 1 kilo mark, which puts them, not far off an average sort of Viking sword or arming sword. But they frequently flare at the tip, and therefore the balance is a little bit further forward. I'm going to talk a bit more about the balance later on. And also, whilst we're on the subject of cavalry swords, if you go to later period things like this, an 1885 trooper saber. Now, they didn't have light and heavy cavalry swords anymore when this sword was in use. Everybody carried the same, so it was just a trooper's saber. But you can see it's quite long for many sabers, and quite heavy. They typically come in just over 1 kilo. So there you go, just over sort of 1 kilo. And whilst I'm on the subject, something like a talwar, an Indian saber. This one's 950 grams. I've got a few, and they're all roughly around about 900 to a kilo. There's not too much variation in the ones I've seen so far. So again, around about 1 kilo, in the range of the cavalry sabers, and typically a little bit heavier than a British infantry saber of the Napoleonic era, but kind of very similar to the Victorian stuff. Right. What else are we going to go on to? The basket hilts. Okay, I didn't actually bring a basket hilt up with me today, but the basket hilt, which was really sort of popular in the round about mid to late 16th century in Britain. There were, of course, European basket hilts in use, things like the Skibona and stuff like that. And the Germans had loads of baskets. I recently talked about the Dussac or Dussage, which had, again, a big basket. And, of course, even as a lot of Europe stopped using them, the Scots carried on. And you can see it right into the 19th century. And even now, ceremonial use, the Scots still use basket hilts. So what was the range of basket hilts? Typically between about 1.1 and about 1.5 kilos. So there's quite a range there. Now, what does that actually work out to? Well, at the bottom end of the scale comes the bottle of wine. So, basket hilt, 1.15, that's about typical. Or the Colt, so that's kind of the lower end of the range for basket hilts. And what do they come up to? Well, about 1.5 kilos, which, funnily enough, is about the weight of the book Swords and Swordsmen by Mike Loades. So there you go. That's something I did weigh and didn't bring up. So again, basket hilts, for a one-handed sword, they tend to be on the heavy end of the scale, and that's hardly surprising because they're the size of a saber with a lot more metalwork on them. So there you go, about 1.1 to 1.5 kilos. Oh, what are we going to go on to? Rapiers. Why not? Okay, a rapier. Now, rapier, of course, is one of those terms in different time periods can mean different things, but when we talk about rapier today, we largely mean the kind of civilian, don't know how that got attached, the civilian self-defense weapon of the sort of mid 16th up to the mid 17th century, with a very long, slender blade and a lot of hand protection and a grip and guard that can be fingered with the index finger wrapping around the quillen onto the ricasso. This is a reproduction exactly of a Wallace collection sword, and it's 1.3 kilos, or a whisker over. The typical weight range for rapiers is, for this kind of size, about 1.2 to 1.4 kilo on average. But you can get them under a kilo, you can get them a whisker over 1.5 as well. But typically a rapier will weigh 1.2 to 1.4 kilos until they transition onto the later period lighter stuff. Right, so we've done that. Longswords. Well, the longsword is in the sword in two hands, the kind of thing that people are training for from, Maya or all the Lecternau lineage stuff. What do they actually weigh? Well, again, there can be, like the katana, quite a bit of variety, but on average you'd be talking about a sword of 1.4 to 1.7 kilo, sort of rough average. Now, there you go. 1 litre bottle of vodka, that is 1.7 kilos. So that's the upper limit of an average sort of longsword. So as you can see, you think of these longswords as being, big, heavy, clumsy weapons, and actually a 1 litre bottle of alcohol weighs the same as the heavy end of the range. So really, the longsword is not as heavy as a lot of people think. And going on lastly to things like the Montante and the Zweihander, now those are the absolute massive kind of man-height swords, gigantic things. And their weight range is usually between 2 and 3 kilos. They can be a little bit heavier, sometimes up to 3.5, but normally in that range of 2 to 3 or up to 3.5. Well, what is at 2 kilos is 2 litre bottle of Coke or lemonade. And what's at 3 kilos? 3 litre bottle of cooking oil. So that's the range of those gigantic kind of swords, which you might think weigh an absolute ton, and people would have you believe, range into the sort of 10 to 20 kilo range or something absurd. No, they're 2 to 3 or 3.5 kilos. So not an awful lot. And that's kind of a cross-section, if you like, of a good variety of swords and some average weights and balances. No, not balances, I've done the average weights. Talk a little bit about balances. Well, what actually is good balance? Well, it depends what you want to use the sword for. In theory, if you wanted it to hit incredibly hard on the cut, you'd want the balance as far forward as possible. And that's why you see something like the light cav 1796. It's designed for cavalry use. It's not going to have the finesse of a sword used on foot. And you want it to be hitting with a lot of power for those smaller number of cuts that you're going to get. You see it flares towards the tip. It therefore has a lot of cutting power. But on foot, it's quite slow compared to some sabers that we use. Balance point is 19 centimeters. That is really far forward, unusually far forward. So yeah, if you want something to hit really hard on the cut, then bring the balance all the way forwards. And if you want it to have a lot of finesse in the point, you're going to want to bring the balance back. And you'll see most swords that use point work a lot, say the Rapier, the smallsword, the Spadron, they're often balancing in the 3 to 4 inch range. Certainly rarely more than 5 inches. What about sabers? Typical range for a saber is 4 to 6 inch balance point. Some cavalry sabers, of course, get a little bit longer. You will see, hussar sabers, which of course this is very much that kind of sword, ranging up to the 19 centimeter mark, which is 7.5, 8 inches, something like that. So they will push it a little bit more. Katanas, the average range is that 4 to 6, which is the same as an infantry saber, funnily enough. And what else have we got? Small swords are commonly 3 to 4 inches. In fact, most swords of most types, historically, fit into the 4 to 6 inch range of balance, which is 10 to 15 centimeters. There are, of course, examples that are outside of that. Like you'll see the light cav going a bit over. My small sword there was a whisker under. But yeah, almost everything fits into 4 to 6 inches. Now, what is good balance? It's really what you want to use the sword for, what style you're using, what you're having to fight against, whether you want to emphasize point work or cut work. It's all a compromise, and there is no answer to what is good balance and what is bad balance. Saying that, I have handled both plenty of antique and original swords that I think have appalling balance, and I've handled plenty more that have fantastic balance. So, of course, that's going to be down to how I want to use a sword. So, yeah, average weight range of swords. One-handed swords tend to fit into the range of just under a kilo to just over a kilo, and two-handed swords tend to fit into the range around about 1.5 kilos and up to the man-sized swords of 2 to 3 kilos, and that's about the common range. Of course, you will always find exceptions to the rule, like the small sword. The small sword is unusually light. So I think that's all I'm going to talk about today. Weights and balances. I hope you find the video interesting. If you've got any questions, please put them in the comments section, and I hope you enjoyed the video.